The Marvel Cinematic Universe is without doubt one of the greatest achievements of the cinematic medium. To make one quality film is hard enough, to create a quality franchise is even harder, but to create a whole universe of interconnected franchises and have it be good and cohesive, that's damn near impossible, as has been repeatedly proven by the many studios who have tried their hand at replicating the MCU's success. However, while generally the MCU consists of really good and fun movies, not all MCU movies are created equally. Some, without doubt, are better than others. That's why, in today's video, I'm going to be ranking all 24 Marvel Cinematic Universe projects, including WandaVision, to work out which ones are the best, which ones are the worst, and which ones sit somewhere in the middle, for me. Please note this is just my opinion, and I'm open to hearing other opinions in the comment section down below. Also, if you like the video, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know by hitting the like button, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see videos about movies, games, whatever. I'm planning on doing all sorts of stuff, but this video in particular is my first venture when talking about movies. With all that said, let's get into it. At number 24, I have Thor: The Dark World. Thor: The Dark World is possibly one of the most boring, formulaic, and uninteresting films I have ever seen. When you've got something as vast and as interesting as Norse mythology, with actors like Anthony Hopkins, Tom Hiddleston, and Chris Hemsworth taking leading roles, and the director Alan Taylor behind some of the best episodes of Game of Thrones, and also the worst, but that hadn't happened yet, your movie has no right being this bland. Malekith is the most boring villain ever to exist. He's just your stereotypical comic book alien demon with no interesting motivations or character traits. The side characters are either extremely forgettable or so annoying that they make me want to forcibly rip my own hair out. Yes, Darcy, you're right, I am looking at you. Thank God WandaVision fixed you. The plot is extremely generic, save the world basic shit. There are many moments in this movie that feel like they should be profound or impactful, but miss the mark mainly due to poor directing. The jokes rarely land, and of course the film climaxes by throwing a bunch of CGI shit on the screen. Weirdly though, most of the film's events are completely ignored by the wider MCU until we get to Endgame. The only things I can think of that are mentioned later are Frigga's death and Loki being on the throne of Asgard, which you can't really avoid mentioning, and even in the latter's case it was like Ragnarok used that as a joke. The film only really gets good whenever Loki's on the screen, and that's mainly down to Tom Hiddleston's excellent acting and his chemistry with Chris Hemsworth. Sorry before The Dark World, but not even Brian Taylor's amazing soundtrack can save you from the bottom of the list. At number 23, I have The Incredible Hulk. The Incredible Hulk shares a lot of the problems of Thor: The Dark World for me, but at least that movie has the benefit of being somewhat connected to the MCU to make it watchable just on that sort of level. You could skip this movie entirely on your MCU rewatch and lose nothing, especially when you consider that Edward Norton was recast as the Hulk by Mark Ruffalo in The Avengers, by which point he's basically an entirely different character. The CGI is a little off, the editing is a little too stylistic for my taste. I just really don't think this movie has aged very well. It screams mid-2000s, it has the stereotypical showdown with the military, and Edward Norton, who is a phenomenal actor, is really underutilized in this. You could have done some great things with Hulk in this movie, but in general he just comes off as boring. There's really not too much to say about this movie. It's a dull movie with a lot of untapped potential, and it's sad that this movie is the only Hulk movie that we've gotten so far out of the MCU. At number 22, I have Captain Marvel. Okay, let me just clear this up out of the way first. I'm not a huge fan of Captain Marvel for many reasons, but none of them are because Brie Larson is a bad actor, or because Captain Marvel is a woman. The film, like the last two I've just mentioned, suffers mainly from being very forgettable, and you may be noticing a pattern here, but I think it sort of works in the MCU's favour. If the worst films in your franchise are the boring and forgettable ones, that at least means you haven't made any films that fans hate and has people ripping each other to shreds all over the internet. The same can't be said for Star Wars or DC. But yes, Captain Marvel is a boring character, easily the most boring MCU franchise lead she, very rarely comes across as anything other than cocky, and it's not a quick-witted, humorous sort of cockiness like Tony Stark, for example. She just seems kind of full of herself. On top of that, the plot suffers from being rather boring. The twist with the Skrulls wasn't really that impactful. It retreads a lot of similar plot beats to other MCU origin movies, and oh my god, they absolutely butchered the story of how Nick Fury lost his eye. Aside from that, the visual effects, especially the de-aging of Samuel L. Jackson, were good. The music was fine, the acting was okay, the opening 30 minutes of the movie are incredibly boring. The movie starts to get a little bit better when Carol gets to Earth. The humour missed the mark a lot for me, and I went away from the movie feeling like very few things of interest had actually happened. In short, just a boring movie that I'm still happy exists because of how happy it makes so many people to see themselves represented on the big screen. Although I'd still argue that literally any of the other pre-existing female characters in the MCU would have been a better choice. At number 21 I have Ant-Man and the Wasp. Oh my god, this movie is so fucking average. I don't really have anything against this movie, I just don't really care for it in the slightest. The movie could be funny at times, but most of the time it fell short or felt forced in. The visual gags created from the concept of a superhero growing and shrinking are starting to wear thin by now, and some of the generic scientific mumbo-jumbo dialogue in this movie is so bad, man. The characters are somewhat likeable, but they seem so stupid at times. The best scenes are with Scott and his daughter. I wasn't really feeling the romance with Hope, and the movie didn't do a particularly good job of explaining what was going on with all the quantum stuff that it tried to blurt at me. The film has a very bland colour palette and doesn't do anything particularly new and exciting with its visual and special effects, beyond the usual size swap and shenanigans, which, in my opinion, the first movie did better. When the jokes land, they land well, but that usually isn't the case. The actors are trying their best, but it's not a particularly engaging story to be working with, and it's absolutely full of plot holes, and the movie is capable of dragging a little bit at times, but it's not really too much of an issue. The soundtrack is okay, but if someone had a gun to my head and asked me to name the most average and uninspiring MCU movie of them all, chances are I would say Ant-Man and the Wasp. At number 20, I have Ant-Man. The first movie is marginally better than its sequel just because, like I say, I think the concept of a shrinking hero is a lot fresher here and may come up with some more interesting situations visually. You get stuff that sort of gives off Honey, I Shrunk the Kids vibes. In addition to that, the jokes seem to land a little bit more often in this movie than in the previous one, and side characters like Luis are a bit more entertaining. The soundtrack is great here, the Ant-Man theme is an absolute banger, and the scene where Scott first tries on the suit and it shows just how terrifying being tiny could be was excellent for me. Also, the 16:9 aspect ratio makes the film at least a little bit visually unique compared to other MCU entries, and it is an adequate introduction to the characters of Scott Lang, Hank Pym and Hope Van Dyne. However, this does feature one of the worst villains of the entire MCU. He's just Obadiah Stane, but even more weirdly evil. Like, what the actual fuck was that scene where he literally just turned some dude into a pile of goo, wiped him up with a tissue, and then flushed him down the toilet? How did that scene get into a Disney movie? And then he tries to murder a 6-year-old child. Darren Cross, I'm sorry mate, but you're a fucking psychopath. What happened to giving villains interesting motivations? The movie also drags at times. It has real trouble keeping consistency with how all the shrinking technology works, and like pretty much every other movie I've talked about, it suffers the same pitfalls of being a rather bland and uninteresting movie. This one literally copies the plot of Iron Man 1 down to the villain. Like, identify one meaningful difference between Darren Cross and Obadiah Stane that isn't the fact that Cross is a bloodthirsty murderer. Again, I don't hate this movie or really any of the movies on this list. They're fine, I'll watch it if I'm flicking through the channels and see them on TV, but pretty much everything else that's in the MCU is better for me. At number 19 I have Thor. Now, Thor does a better job in my opinion of depicting Norse mythology than both the Dark World and Ragnarok. The Dark World takes it in a very gritty MCU sort of direction, while Ragnarok takes the Thor franchise in the direction of comedy, which I personally prefer, but it did mean that the movie was perhaps less focused on the Norse gods. As usual for the four movies, the acting talent is great here. Anthony Hopkins, Tom Hiddleston, and Chris Hemsworth, as well as Natalie Portman. And honestly, I was sold on Thor and Jane's romance in this movie. The scenes on Earth are definitely the best for me. I'm a sucker for those sorts of fish out of water storylines, of which Thor definitely is. It's definitely not an insanely original plot of becoming worthy of your power again so you can save the day, but it is executed fairly well, so I will give it a pass. The soundtrack in this movie, like a lot of the MCU movies, is quite good, and set design is absolutely superb. Asgard actually looks magical and otherworldly in this, as opposed to the later Thor movies, where I think it loses some of its magical charm. However, Chris Hemsworth's blonde fucking eyebrows were such an eyesore for the whole movie, I couldn't take my eyes off them. And as much as I love Anthony Hopkins, some of his acting decisions did seem weird at times. The battle at the end was a bit subpar though, and all those Dutch camera angles were just really disorienting, which is a major problem when like half of your movie is Dutch camera angles. Aside this, again, there's just nothing really unique about this movie which makes it stand out and for it to go ahead of the other films on the list. At number 18, I have Iron Man 2. Now at this point in the list, we're crossing over into movies that I actually like. Movies that, given the choice, I'd actively seek out to sit down and watch. See, even though I do have Iron Man 2 as being relatively low down on this list, I still really enjoy this movie, and that's because of the amazing acting and chemistry on display here. You could have the worst movie in the world, but when you've got Robert Downey Jr. in a leading role, that automatically propels it for me. The movie tries to juggle about 5 plots simultaneously, and does none of them particularly amazingly, but it does a good enough job of some of them that you walk away satisfied with your experience. I absolutely loved every scene with Justin Hammer. Sam Rockwell absolutely kills it in the role. Seeing him play off with Robert Downey Jr. is a surreal experience. I absolutely loved all the scenes of Tony discovering a new element. It reminded me of his suit building scenes from the first one, which this movie sorely lacked, and the movie briefly touches on Tony's alcoholism from the comics, from which we get a great scene of Tony and Rhodey having a fight in the suits. Aside from that though, the action in this movie isn't excellent, and for an Iron Man movie, we don't really get to see much of Iron Man. It's mostly Tony Stark, which is fine. You don't have to do a whole movie with him in the suit, but I would have appreciated a little more. The movie is also a little bit weird because its original soundtrack is probably the worst in the MCU, but to make up for that, it has some of the best non-original songs in the MCU, besides from things like the Guardians movies, obviously. As well as this, Whiplash was not a great villain. The movie would have been entirely better in my opinion if Justin Hammer had been the sole villain, and in fact there's a great video by Nando V Movies about why that's the case, which I will link in the description if I remember to. All in all, Iron Man 2 is an average movie that's propelled greatly by the extraordinary acting talent on display. At number 17, I have Spider-Man Far From Home. Now, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but yes, Spider-Man Far From Home is far too focused on the death of Tony Stark. I actually don't mind too much the role that Tony played in Homecoming, because I simply assumed that it was the start of his character arc and journey, and that eventually Peter would become his own character. And I also assumed that after the death of Tony Stark, that would be the perfect time to do so. And I get that that is the plot of this movie, I just don't think we needed to spend 2 whole movies to get to that point. His villain is created by Tony Stark. The MacGuffin of this movie is one of Tony Stark's inventions, and in this film, Peter is grieving Tony Stark. Of those 3 things, only the last one reasonably needed to be in the film. I honestly have a theory that Marvel tried to make these films as tied to the MCU as possible, so that if anything did go wrong with their deal, like we were worried might have done in 2019, Sony would have some serious issues trying to write themselves out of it. Besides all that though, I did like this movie. I thought that Mysterio was a great villain played perfectly by Jake Gyllenhaal. I was a huge fan of the vision sequence that Peter goes through. I like that Spidey saves the day with his spider sense in this movie, and I think that the romance plotline between Peter and MJ was done very well and very realistically. Some of the humour lands, some of the humour falls a bit short for me. Visual and special effects were nothing special, but they were serviceable. I'm still annoyed that we don't have any mention of Ben Parker, and that Aunt May does not seem to care a bit that Peter is Spider-Man. I can really enjoy this movie if I shut my brain off, but as a Spider-Man movie it felt really short and could feel really lacking at times. Luckily though, if you just watch it as a teen comedy MCU movie, it's fun enough. At number 16, I have Black Panther. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think Black Panther is an amazing movie, which is why it's not that high on the list, but it probably has more cultural significance than all the other MCU movies combined. The fact that so many people finally get to see themselves represented in a meaningful and powerful way in a comic book movie on the big screen is reason enough alone for this movie to exist. The thing that Black Panther truly excels at is its world building. The movie makes Wakanda one of the most captivating places in the MCU, with a rich history and culture that sets it apart. The costumes, set design and props in this movie are all magnificent as well, and so is the tribal music. And of course, the late great Chadwick Boseman absolutely kills it as the Black Panther. Every single thing about this movie feels authentic. It also provides us with one of the MCU's best villains in Killmonger, along with the return of the brilliant Andy Serkis as Claw. It is also one of the most impactful MCU movies, with meaning and purpose behind its insightful commentary on colonization. However, aside from T'Challa, the villains and Shuri, most of the other characters in the movie aren't all too interesting. The action scenes were good at times, but other times started to fall apart due to bad CGI. I'm serious man, the fight between Killmonger and T'Challa genuinely looks like a video game. The last third of the movie isn't really up to scratch with the rest, mainly due to an interesting ideological conflict being settled in an ugly CGI mess, which is unfortunately why it's not ranked higher on this list. At number 15, I've got Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange is a weird one because while it has one of the most unique premises of the MCU, its basic story structure is exactly the same as Iron Man 1, just like AntMan and a multitude of other MCU origin movies. Gifted person who is kind of an asshole has something life-changing happen to him, which causes him to reevaluate himself and gains new powers/technology, which he utilizes to do good. It's a good story structure, but it's really getting old by 2016. Regardless though, Benedict Cumberbatch is amazing as Doctor Strange. He's literally perfect in the role. This is probably the most interesting MCU movie visually to me. Doctor Strange's bad LSD trip stands out in particular, as does all the mirror dimension bending and the end with Dormammu. And speaking of the end, the way Doctor Strange defeats Dormammu is the most creative villain defeat in the MCU. Literally just dying in a loop until Dormammu gets tired of killing him. The directors have said Doctor Strange could have spent thousands of years in that loop, which absolutely blows my mind. Like I say, it's disconnected enough so that you can watch the movie without having seen anything else in the MCU, so that's a positive. I also loved pretty much all of the scenes of Doctor Strange learning to do magic and his scenes with the Ancient One. However, Caecilius was really lackluster as a villain for me, and the movie sometimes dragged in the wrong areas, and as I said, the plot is just really unoriginal, which limits how high it can be on my list. At number 14, I have SpiderMan Homecoming. SpiderMan Homecoming suffers from a lot of the same issues as Spider-Man Far From Home, but as I said when I got to that movie, it's less egregious here because it's the start of Peter's arc. I also just find it to be a more fun movie than Far From Home, simply because it felt like a genuine Spider-Man story set in high school, rather than this otherworldly threat. Plus, I prefer the Spider-Man stories set in New York. Tom Holland plays a young Peter Parker in Spider-Man brilliantly, the story is engaging, and it's one of the MCU movies that's actually funny. It also gave us a new perspective on the Marvel Universe from the eyes of a high school teenager, which is always something I've been interested in seeing. The twist of the Vulture being Peter's date's dad was genuinely shocking. Like, usually in these movies I can predict these twists coming, but it totally caught me off guard and was really effective. The Vulture isn't quite as good as Mysterio for me, but he's definitely still an excellent villain. As much as I didn't like how much of a role Tony had in the story, when he did show up, it was Robert Downey Jr. in the scene, so I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy his scenes. Homecoming is actually a pretty good movie all round actually, but again, the thing preventing it from climbing higher on the list is its reluctance to pay attention to core Spider-Man themes. At number 13, I have Captain America: The First Avenger. Now, despite being the weakest of the Captain America trilogy, The First Avenger is still a great movie. It does a great job of establishing the character of Captain America and making him work for a modern audience. He's played brilliantly by Chris Evans, and I get a bit of an Indiana Jones vibe from the narrative in this story. what with having to stop the Nazis who have went after an ancient treasure. The soundtrack by Alan Silvestri is top tier, as are all the action scenes. Something this movie does really well is tell stories through montages. I really like the Star Spangled Man with a Plan montage, as well as the montage of the Howling Commandos taking Hydra bases. All the characters here are excellent, and it's great to see an MCU movie that's set in a different time period. Seeing Steve Rogers before the serum was also something interesting, even if he looked like he had the body of a 10-year-old. The movie is genuinely emotional as it sells you both on the character of Steve and his relationship with Peggy, and it turns into a tragedy when he makes the ultimate sacrifice and wakes up 70 years later. Cap's line, "I had a date," is honestly one of the most impactful lines of the entire MCU for me. However, the movie did have to move at breakneck speed at times due to the story spanning several years, and I really wish we got to see more of the Howling Commandos in action outside of that montage. And honestly, the name of this movie is pretty dumb. It's called The First Avenger, but the movie doesn't really have anything to do with the Avengers. We all know the reason for this is because they wanted to hype up the Avengers release in the next year, but still I don't like it when movie titles are as meta as this one. Regardless, this movie is still a great movie, and the only thing obstructing it is 12 other great films. Well, we're halfway there, and at number 12 I have Iron Man 3. Iron Man 3 is a seriously underrated movie. I get that people don't like the Mandarin twist, but honestly I wasn't really following the MCU hype back in 2013, and I wasn't into comics when I first watched this movie, so when I went into it, I can't say I was too disappointed. Similar to Iron Man 2, the acting by Robert Downey Jr. instantly secures this movie a higher spot, but also the fact that this movie actually has an engaging story helps it out. It feels very real to see Tony struggle after the events of the Avengers, and I'm glad Marvel decided to go down that road of showing a man with PTSD. Iron Man 3 also makes a ton of sense when you consider Tony's overall arc, as well as how it all leads into Endgame. I love the scenes with Harley. It's a relationship I wish we got to see developed further in the MCU, instead of just having him randomly show up at Tony's funeral in Endgame. I loved all the suits of armour in the Iron Legion, and I thought that Aldrich Killian was a serviceable villain. Some of the action scenes can be off in this movie, but I really liked the one where Tony saves all the passengers on the plane. It's one of the few moments in his trilogy of Tony doing hero stuff. Some of the jokes felt weird though, like when Tony was cracking wise, even though he was under the impression that Pepper was dead. And even though this is a perfect way to conclude his trilogy, Age of Ultron just sort of ignores a lot of what happens at the end of this movie, which I guess is more Age of Ultron's fault, but still, it felt like it made the movie of lesser consequence. Speaking of which, at number 11 I have Avengers Age of Ultron. Like Iron Man 3, I really do feel that Age of Ultron is an underrated movie. Yes, it's the weakest of the 4 Avengers movies, but it's also the slowest paced of the Avengers movies. The first one had to bring the team together, Infinity War had a million characters, so it had to speed through the plot like Sonic the Hedgehog, and Endgame was burdened with concluding 22 films. Age of Ultron is the only one of them that really gives you a chance to breathe and know these characters. The scene with the Avengers at the party just hanging out and having a good time is a particular standout, as is all the scenes of them talking at the farm. The movie definitely suffers from the fact that it's trying to set up basically all of Phase 3 at once, and as a result it feels like a less focused experience, but there are some amazing action scenes and some real character moments. The only thing I hated was the romance between Nat and Bruce. I don't know, it just didn't feel right for me. Ultron is a good villain. I get that people didn't like that he was making jokes, but this version of Ultron is derived a lot from Tony Stark, so to be honest, it makes sense to me. I love that we get to see the Avengers working as a team in the movie, and whilst the introduction to Wanda was great, I'll forever be mad that Quicksilver, the person with super speed, died to fucking bullets. The soundtrack is also really good too. Danny Elfman does some cool reworks of Alan Silvestri's themes that I honestly think are underrated. The movie is a bit of a mess, and I understand why people didn't like it at the time, but for me, the more MCU content it has released, the better Age of Ultron has been made for me, which is why it's as high as it is. At number 10, I have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Now, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 might not be as airtight as its predecessor, and its jokes can be a little too immature at times, But call me crazy, I have a more fun time with this movie. I accept that the first one is a better movie, but I don't know, the tone of this one just feels more light-hearted, and the Guardians are already together as a family at the start of the movie. It just makes the movie feel more fun. I love the zany and wacky colour palette. The Guardians movies always have this really unique visual style that makes every shot look interesting. And as always, James Gunn shows his incredible taste with this movie's soundtrack. Banger after banger of 80s hits that perfectly fit the tone of the scenes they're matched with. I quite like the arc that Peter goes on through the movie, as well as the arc with Rocket and Yondu. Particularly in the latter's case, Guardians 2 does a good job of taking characters you kinda thought were an asshole in the last movie and making them sympathetic to the point where when Yondu dies, it's a genuine gut punch to you. Also, I debated giving the number 1 spot to this movie just solely based on Baby Groot. The action scenes are exhilarating and they're actually engaging, and James Gunn continues to succeed at making these movies fucking hilarious, especially Drax. I love the theme of family in this film. By the end of Guardians, you sort of get the sense that they're an unwilling team, but by the end of this one, they really do feel like a family. Like I say, the only thing holding it back for me is the fact that this movie can have a tendency to get a little silly, and the jokes don't quite land as often as they do in the first one. At number 9, I have The Avengers. Now, as much as I love this film, it really hasn't aged well. All the costumes look very camp, and a lot of the characters are caricatures of themselves. What came before it was mainly quite grounded movies, and what came after it was mostly grounded movies, at least as far as the characters and tone were concerned. So The Avengers always stood out like a bit of a weird outlier. Despite that, I really liked this movie. For the first movie of its kind, The Avengers does a really good balancing act of all the main characters, and because there are fewer Avengers in this movie, all 6 of the main Avengers have some sort of definable arc of some kind. Thor and Steve do get neglected a little bit, but there is still some semblance of an arc there. Hulk is fucking terrifying in this movie. They really dialed him up to 11 to be a force to be reckoned with, especially the scene with Nat on the helicarrier. Loki is a really fun villain. He's just so outwardly flamboyant and ridiculous, but it's hard not to have fun when you're watching him. You can just tell Tom Hiddleston is having a great time every scene he's in. The action is amazing, the soundtrack is of course superb, it features one of the most iconic movie themes of the 2010s, however the final battle scene does go on a little bit too long without too much happening. I also kind of don't like Steve's characterization in this movie. He's kind of just a lame old man, which is annoying because the previous movie just established that Captain America was fucking cool. It's like Joss Whedon didn't get the memo. And to be honest, Joss Whedon's humour, it ain't it, man. Like, this movie tries to be funny so hard, and maybe 10% of the time it lands. At least Age of Ultron was a slight improvement in the comedy department. You know what, thinking about it, The Avengers is actually quite flawed, but come on, it's the first goddamn Avengers movie. I feel bad ranking it any lower than this, just based on how monumental it was. At number 8, I have Iron Man. Iron Man was the very first film to kick off the MCU, and I'm happy to report it's also one of the best. The 8th best to be specific, which doesn't sound that impressive, but the MCU is huge, man. It's like the equivalent of being second or third in a normal franchise. For a start, the absolute highlight of the suit building sequences. Over the course of the movie, we get to see Tony build 3 Iron Man armors, each one better than the last, and honestly the scenes are so fucking cool. And you can't imagine it possibly getting any cooler, and then he goes and he actually fucking uses the suit, and at this point in the MCU, and by this point I mean approximately 20 minutes into the MCU, this is next level shit. The movie has an almost improvisational tone, like they got Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow in a scene and gave them a general framework but let them come up with the dialogue on the spot, which I actually do think they did for a couple of scenes, and the movie does not suffer at all for it. It actually gives the scenes air of spontaneity and humanity and an unexpected sense of humour. Also, I can't not talk about RDJ's performance. Robert Downey Jr. is Tony Stark and Tony Stark is him. It's perfect, none more so than in this movie. And I know this, I say this for pretty much all these movies, but yeah, the action scenes are great. The Iron Man theme is so cool. but not as cool as the Black Sabbath that's all over this film. And honestly, for a film in 2008, this looks great. The Iron Man suit actually looks better here than in Endgame, because in this movie it's mostly real, unlike that movie where it's mostly CGI. Overall, a great film. The only thing that held it back was the Ironmonger. At no point during any of the scenes where we saw Obadiah Stane did I think he would want to be the Ironmonger. But the movie needs a villain with a suit to beat up, so I guess that's what it's doing. But overall, Iron Man 1, great movie and a perfect start to a legendary saga. At number 7, I have Guardians of the Galaxy. When Guardians of the Galaxy released, the MCU was in serious danger of becoming stale. It took this movie to broaden everyone's horizons to just what an MCU movie could be. James Gunn expanded the world of boots-on-the-ground Earth-based heroes fighting soldiers and robots into a space opera with a diegetic movie soundtrack featuring James Gunn's amazing taste and banger after banger of songs that, just like in the sequel, perfectly capture the tone of the scenes they're in. James Gunn also takes some of the comic's most obscure characters like Rocket Raccoon and Groot and turns them into household names. He didn't have the easy job of starting with characters like Captain America or Iron Man. The thing that this movie gets right is the characters. The plot is mostly your average save-the-world MCU affair, but because the characters are so good, you don't even care. The movie is also the second funniest one in the MCU. I say second because we're going to get to the funniest one in a second. I'm sure MCU fans can guess what I'm talking about. However, as much as I absolutely love this movie, the end is just too fucking long, man. The battle on Xandar goes on for absolutely ages, to the point where it seriously starts to get boring, which is surprising in a film like this. The film was at its best in the prison scene, I think, or just any time Quill's songs are playing. I can't begin to get over how much I love the music choice in this film. All in all, Guardians of the Galaxy is a great, fun movie and a perfect example of what an MCU movie should be. At number 6, I have Thor Ragnarok. Now this is the peak of comedy in the MCU. Taika Waititi took an otherwise boring franchise and turned it into the funniest movie in the MCU, taking inspirations both from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies and from the Iron Man franchise's improvisational tone. Ragnarok is bright, it's colourful, it's fun. Chris Hemsworth does an outstanding job in the leading role as Thor. This movie transforms Thor from what was previously a very dull and weirdly Shakespearean character into an actual relatable person. This is the only MCU movie where the jokes always land for me. I've seen some deleted scenes where they don't, which means Taika was smart in knowing which ones to keep on the cutting room floor. Mark Ruffalo and Tessa Thompson are also great in this. It's good to see the Valkyries in live action, and to see a version of a Hulk that's not just a murderous killing rage machine. Also, I can't not mention Tom Hiddleston. This film had a great redemption arc for Loki, which felt great to see after so many years of seeing him in the MCU. The film is surprisingly full of really important moments for the MCU, such as the destruction of both Thor's hammer and Asgard. More happened in this movie than both of the other 4 movies combined, in my opinion, and yet the film never feels like it's too fast-paced. However, there are some issues with the movie. Hela wasn't the most engaging of villains. Whenever it would cut away from Thor and Hulk on Sakaar to show us her, I just wish it would get back to Sakaar. The scenes on Asgard just aren't great. Also, it does have like a flippant disrespect to the films that preceded it. The Warriors 3's deaths were pitiful, and Lady Sif's and Jane Foster's absence from the movie feels a bit jarring. Luckily though, these problems look like they're going to be fixed next year with the next Thor movie, Love and Thunder. But overall, Ragnarok is an amazing time and fully deserves its spot on the list. At number 5, I have WandaVision. WandaVision is by far the most unique thing on this list. Not only is this the only TV show on the list, but also WandaVision leaves behind the traditional MCU story structure in order to try something risky and daring, and I'm happy to report it pulls it off magnificently. The show is a mind-bending, reality-warping parody of classic American sitcoms told through the eyes of 2 of the most powerful Avengers that have never gotten the chance to be on the centre stage until now, and Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany rises to the challenge magnificently. Each episode perfectly encapsulates the era it's in. One of my favourite parts of every episode were the era-specific intros each one had. It's sprinkled with just enough mystery to keep you guessing about the mystery the show presents. I honestly love tuning in every week and engaging with the discussions about what it could all mean, but honestly some of you had your expectations way too high. The show is extremely emotionally resonant. It tells a tale of grief and the various stages of it, and throughout we're not sure if we're supposed to see Wanda as a villain in all this or not. It plays with some dubious morality and some interesting concepts to make a really unique show. Also, Kathryn Hahn is wonderful as Agatha Harkness. You can really tell she's having a blast filming all her scenes. The only letdowns for me was the last episode. I wasn't a fan of how they baited people with Pietro. That was a little disappointing for me. I understand why people are upset with that. And I was a little annoyed that they chose to end such a unique show with what was essentially a CGI light battle. But overall, WandaVision is an amazing show that I can't recommend enough, and I hope the MCU continues to do more unique stuff like this in the future. At number 4, I have Captain America Civil War. Outside of the Avengers movies, Civil War is one of the most ambitious Marvel movies, and on the whole, I think the Russo brothers did an outstanding job. Despite not quite having the scale that the comic Civil War did, the conflict between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark is presented brilliantly. The fight at the airport is just pure comic book action in all its glory, and we get a closer look at the new Avengers on the team like Wanda and Vision, as well as introducing us to the characters of Spider-Man and Black Panther, and getting those iconic characters spot on. The action in this movie is some of the best in the whole MCU, genuine edge-of-your-seat stuff that keeps you engaged. The movie also did a great job of making both the perspectives of Steve and Tony sympathetic, both before and after the film. Audiences were divided on who was right. It's a question that the fan base still ponders today. And the moment Tony realizes it was Bucky who killed his mother is gut-wrenching, as is his fight with Steve that follows it. It really does feel like an Avengers movie, although obviously with more focus on Captain America than the other Avengers. The soundtrack is amazing. They delivered an amazing villain with Baron Zemo, who I am loving seeing in The Falcon and Winter Soldier. The movie is so important, and it sets up so many plot points for the MCU, as well as putting the pieces into play for Infinity War. The only thing that holds this movie back for me is its smaller scale. It feels like a missed opportunity to do Civil War this early on, rather than waiting until the universe is as big as I'm sure it will be in 5, 10, 15 years time. Aside from that though, Civil War is an excellent movie. At number 3, I have Captain America the Winter Soldier. Captain America the Winter Soldier was the movie that proved that Marvel movies can be both mature and good. After previously Thor the Dark World tried maturity and failed, whilst the Avengers was a wacky and zany movie but succeeded massively. I think when people call this movie a political thriller, they're exaggerating a little bit. It's a gritty action superhero movie with some political themes, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it a political thriller. Regardless though, this movie is superb. I sound like a broken record with the whole action thing, but trust me when I say none more so than in this movie. The action is superb, from the Nick Fury car scene to the Lemurian Star to the fight between Captain America and the Winter Soldier. All the characters in this feel real, like actual concrete people, and it's really entertaining to watch them interact with each other, especially the relationships between Steve and Natasha and Steve and Sam. The movie also fixes what Joss Whedon did to Captain America in the Avengers and makes him even cooler than he was in the first Avenger. This is probably one of the most inspiring MCU movies for me, of a man standing up for what he believes in against all odds. Samuel L. Jackson is also amazing in this, and the reveal that Hydra had infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. was done spectacularly. Captain America the Winter Soldier truly feels like the perfect superhero movie for the modern age, which is why it's ranked so highly on this list. At number 2, I have Avengers Infinity War. Infinity War. What more could possibly be said about Infinity War that hasn't been said already? This is easily the most rewatchable MCU movie for me. It's also the MCU movie that has the hardest job in juggling the most characters, so the Russo brothers make the brilliant decision to make Thanos the protagonist of the film, and have us follow his journey as he collects all the stones, despite the fact that we don't want him to get them. Every character is utilised in some way, and the fights that they have against Thanos are so fun to watch. Not only do they do creative things with the powers of the heroes, especially in the cases of Iron Man and Doctor Strange, They also do creative things with the Infinity Stones instead of just doing the generic blast of energy. Thanos also became one of the most well-known pop culture icons single-handedly because of this movie. He is this generation's Darth Vader. In the span of just a year, pretty much everyone under a certain age knew who Thanos was after 1,000 memes spawned from him. This movie truly is the culmination of everything that came before it. To finally see everyone together in one movie on the big screen was fantastic. Alan Silvestri returns to score, and everything from the soundtrack to CGI to set design was spot on. And who can forget the ending of this movie, man? All your favourite heroes vanishing to dust before your eyes, leaving you shattered as you struggle to comprehend what happened after the villain smiles victoriously and you're forced through the almost memorial-like credits. It's a fantastic subversion of expectations, but in a good way, and it results in an incredible movie that will always be an unforgettable cinema experience for me. And if you haven't guessed it by now, at number 1 I have Avengers Endgame. Now, I know, it's not the most original of Marvel movies to be my favourite, but everyone has to love it for a reason, right? It's also something to be said that the Russo brothers' 4 MCU movies take up all 4 of my highest spots. That might just be my taste, or it could be that the Russo brothers are the best directors the MCU has ever had. Endgame had a monstrous task on its hand that I wouldn't envy of anyone, wrapping up 22 films in a good and cohesive way. In fact, the exact same year Endgame came out, Game of Thrones and Star Wars proved to us that it's no simple task, and they had far less stuff to be wrapping up than Endgame did, and still failed spectacularly. This movie is fucking incredible, man. For as long as I'm alive and without brain injury, I'll remember the experience of watching this in the cinema for the first time. For starters, when they killed Thanos in the first 20 minutes of the movie, skipped to 5 years later, by which point barely any of the footage from the trailers was in the movie, I knew this was going to be a different type of film. The smaller cast allows the movie to be slower paced than Infinity War, and for it to focus on the relationships between the characters and their arcs. Tony and Steve's arcs wrap up perfectly in this film, and I couldn't imagine a better end for them. The movie almost works like a reverse Infinity War. Instead of Thanos hunting the stones, it's the heroes, and it sprinkles in so much fan service that it's actually good and gives everything satisfying payoffs. The entire thing just feels like a love letter to the fans. And oh my god, this movie is fucking chock to the brim of hype moments. When Steve picked up Mjolnir, I was ready to go home and clock out, man. I was convinced that there was not a single way the film could get any better for me. And then that happened. The portals opened and all the heroes that we've met over the course of 22 films appear from them. Alan Silvestri's amazing score swells, and I shit you not, this is easily the best moment I've ever experienced in the cinema, bar none. The entire final battle is excellent, you can't keep your eyes off the screen even for a moment, and Tony's final sacrifice is so impactful, man, and the perfect way to wrap up 22 films. As cliche as it is, I can say without question that Avengers Endgame is the best MCU film for me. Well, this video is a lot longer than I imagined it being. Sorry for that, but thank you for sticking around this long. If you did enjoy the video, once again, I would be really grateful if you liked and subscribe to the channel for more content. I make videos about the entire video game industry, and now I'm branching it out to TV and films that I love and hate. So stay tuned for that. Also, comment below your personal ranking of the MCU, I'd love to see how we differ, and if you really want to help me out, share this video with your friends. With all that said, thanks again guys, and I'll see you in the next one.